There's similarities in terms of the fact that there's certain ways that you have to play to the camera, but I think there's also kind of, just as a function of the fact that there's big cultural differences in general between the West and the East, a lot of those cultural differences also play into how the camera is used, and then also just in terms of how the fight scenes are developed. Oftentimes with Western style fight scenes, there's much more of an emphasis on like realism. Like they always want fight scenes to be as realistic as humanly possible. Like what's real? What would it really look like? Basically, which in a lot of ways kind of fits the philosophy of Western martial arts. For the most part, Western martial arts have always kind of followed, it's always been about form following function. Like none of the stuff was made to look pretty. It was just made to work. Whereas if you look at Eastern martial arts, in particular, those coming from Korea, Japan, China, there's always been a certain aesthetic value to it too. There's always been like a certain importance of beauty within it. And if you look at kata, for example, or forms, there's always been this importance of how beautifully executed it is. And then when you look at the fight scenes, that's also reflected in the fight scenes, because you look at fight scenes that come from films that are made in Hong Kong or in Japan, and oftentimes they're really fantastic, right? Like dudes are flying all over the place, and like there's a certain surrealism because the emphasis is on the aesthetic value of the fight, like how beautiful and like how continuous it is, and the hero is oftentimes looks almost superhuman, and you don't see that as much in Western style fight scenes. So oftentimes when they try to create Eastern style fight scenes in the West, it just doesn't necessarily work as well because they're coming from a different mentality. So you need to understand the mentality that they're doing it with in the East, to really produce it in the same kind of way. And that's what I'm trying to study out there. One of the first jobs that I had to do out here, I ran into that problem, is because I was, the way I was trained to do fight scenes was with a really strong emphasis on aesthetic beauty. You know what I mean? Like after every phrase, you always pose out, and there's always lots of like big exaggerated motions and things like that. And then the first time I had to work with a director here, all they kept saying was smaller, don't move so much. You don't have to make it so big, and I was actually training some of the actors as well, and I had to kind of train them and then untrain them because he didn't like the way any of them moved after I trained them, because that wasn't what he was going for. And that's when I really became conscious of just how big of a difference there is. And, there's people that are more on, on the Eastern side out here, and there's some directors in the East that have a really Western style as well. There's always some kind of crossover. But in general, I think there's just a general philosophical difference from what I've seen. But for the most part, fight choreography in the way that it's done in East Asia, it's still not necessarily well known in the States, mainly because of the language barrier. Because a lot of the people that get into, stunt work in Asia, and they get into fight choreography and things like that, usually they don't speak English because they're not the kind of guys that go to college. Or they're not the kind of guys that sit down and study foreign languages. Like, this is what they do. And that's the only thing they do. So if you want to learn that, you have to be able to communicate with them in their language. In the West, stunt fighting is just a part of stunts in general. Like you have a stunt guy, and then that stunt guy has his specialization. Oftentimes, martial artists specialize in stunt fighting, but stunt fighting is just considered a part of stunts. Whereas, in Asia, or at least in Japan, and most likely Hong Kong and Korea as well, stunt fighting is just referred to as action, and then action is a separate thing from stunts. So there's a lot of people who only do action, and they don't touch stunts at all. And, like at least in Japan, there's just tons and tons and tons and tons of action teams of people, who get together 2 or 3 times a week, and all they do is just fight choreography. For maybe 2 or 3 hours a day, 3 times a week, is they just practice fight choreography. And they're specialists just in that. And, some of them won't have any training whatsoever in any other other kinds of stunts. And that's really common out there. Whereas here, like, you wouldn't necessarily see that. And I'm on one of these teams, and I train the same way. I spend about 4 hours a week training for fight choreography aside from my normal martial arts training. You know, there's tricking teams. You know, you have like XMA teams, right? And in general, I think XMA guys make great stunt guys, except for the fact that there's still, even if you have those performance skills, you still have to learn how to do it for a camera, because doing it for the camera is different. You know, the way you throw a kick, if there's a camera involved, then you have to think about where the camera is. And, you know, if you're doing it against someone else, then you have to think about where you are, where the other person is, and where the camera is, because from one angle, the kick might just look beautiful and it might completely sell. If you change the camera's angle just a little bit, it's not going to sell. So you always have to be kind of conscious and aware of that. So there's XMA teams, which would be great, but even so, they'd still have to learn how to move for the camera because it's different. And then you have stunt teams, but there aren't teams of people who get together just to do fight choreography for film like there are in Asia. It just kind of doesn't exist out here. When I first got to Japan, well, it's a long story, but basically when I first got to Japan, I started off doing security work for visiting Hollywood or Korean celebrities, just because I also speak Korean. And as a function of that, I got into doing martial arts like Krav Maga and Jiu-Jitsu and Han-Mudo, and a lot of things with like joint locking or submission holds or whatnot. But then aside from that, I also wanted to get into entertainment, just simply because a lot of people said I would be good at it. So then I went into an agency and I registered, and then they happened to be casting for martial arts extras for a Godzilla movie. So then I got into Godzilla Final Wars as a martial arts extra. And then while I was on set, I noticed all these different people walking around with, you know, such and such action club or such and such action team, like on the back of their jackets. So I asked one of the stunt guys, I was like, what's an action team? And they said, well, you have an action director who comes just to direct the fight sequences, and then he comes with his own team of guys that he brings, and then they do all the fight scenes. And then I was like, well, okay, well, how do you get onto one? And then he said, I'll introduce you. And then he introduced me to an action director by the name of Yuji Shimomura, who at the time was just kind of up and coming, and who now is one of the biggest in Japan. So I've been blessed in that I've kind of known him for a large part of his career, and I've gotten to work with him throughout a lot of it. Basically, that stunt guy introduced me to Shimomura-san, and then I showed him kind of what I can do, and he said, well, why don't you come and train with me and my guys? So then I came and then I started training with him, and when I first started training, like, I didn't speak a word of Japanese at that point. So all I could do was just kind of watch and follow along. But then eventually, just because I was training with them all the time, step by step, I was able to actually learn the language largely through these guys. And then eventually, I was able to kind of turn it into a career. And then once it got to a point that I was doing it regularly, there were still a lot of holes in my knowledge just because I was learning in a foreign language that I only understood like maybe 30-40% of what they were saying, if that, especially because there's so much technical jargon that goes into this type of thing. So that's when I started going back and forth to the States so I could train in the States too, so that I could kind of fill in the holes of what I was missing because of the language barrier out here. I could train in my own language in the States. I'd come back to train on any kind of stunt fighting or stage combat training was the closest thing I could find, was like how combat was portrayed for theater and for film in the States, just stage combat, basically. So, the organizations like the Society of American Fight Directors, or the one that I mentioned before, MACE, Movement and Combat Education, or I also studied at the United Stuntmen's Association's International Stunt School. Anything I could find, in any way that I could find to train, I would just train in whatever I could find, basically. But then as I was doing that, that's when I kind of started noticing how differently things were done there and here.